So hello and welcome to another episode of TopTenz. I'm your interim host, Karl Smallwood. That's Karl with a K, Smallwood the small one a wood, don't you forget it. And today we're talking about 10 of history's greatest pranks and hoaxes. And at this point in the video, I would normally encourage our audience to go give the original author the script for this video was based on a follow on social media, but I can't do that today because the original author is me, I guess. So rather than promoting my own stuff, I'm going to say, if anyone out there has an affinity and love for writing and researching, if you can find a list of 10 loosely interconnected things and then write an article, join them all together, we will pay you money for doing that. There'll be links below you can follow to apply for that gig. But let's get to the video, shall we? In the age of the internet, the idea of what constitutes a prank has changed somewhat, and what used to be defined as a harmless moment of fun at another person's expense has been taken to mean everything from walking into people's homes unannounced to pretending to commit a terrorist act. Both of those are things that internet pranksters have done for clout, by the way. So let's cast our eyes back and look at some classic historical pranks and hoaxes that show you don't need to hurt anyone to play a good prank, just a heroic amount of commitment to the bit. Starting with number 10, the Sydney Iceberg. We'd like you to imagine for a moment that it's April 1st, 1978, and you're standing looking over Sydney Harbour. Off in the distance, you spot what appears to be a small iceberg being towed by a small tug. You, of course, tap the person next to you on the shoulder to ask them what the hell is going on. They respond in a flat, serious tone reminiscent of someone telling you the colour of the sky. Oh, that's the Dickenberg. Are you perhaps here for a Dixicle? I hear they make everything taste delicious. A few moments later, it begins to rain and the iceberg seems to melt away, which, you guess, makes sense. Ice does melt after all, but not that fast. And wait, is that a pile of plastic on a barge? The hell is going on? Well, gentle reader, you've just been dicked. To explain, the iceberg, quote unquote, was nothing more than an elaborate prank by Australian businessman and appropriately named prankster Dick Smith, who, for no other reason than he was bored and thought it'd be funny, made the fake iceberg just to see how many people he could trick into thinking it was real. The answer? Quite a lot of people. And to sell people on this, Smith had hundreds of employees call local news agencies reporting on an iceberg in the harbour, and even announced a short while earlier to the media his plans to source ice from Antarctica, which he then marketed as Dixicles, claiming that the glacier-sauced hunks of ice would be of superior quality to any ice bought domestically, wryly noting, no doubt with a veiled grin, that Dixicles would make your beverage of choice taste excellent. All in all, Smith spent about $1,400 dues on the prank, explaining to the press that while he did plan to tow an actual iceberg from the Antarctic, he thought it'd be really funny to pretend to do it too. Number 9, the Piltown Man Fossil. Now let's head to England. It's 1911 and you're a man of science, an anthropologist. Surely nobody's going to pull the wool over your eyes. Suddenly, the atmosphere is abuzz. Someone has found it, the skull of an early hominid. Pre-man, the stopgap between humanity and the apes. The missing link. Of course, the person who made the discovery, a workman eking out a modest income in a gravel pit, had no idea what they'd found and smashed it apart with a hammer, assuming it to be a coconut, but even in pieces, you know what this is. History. Our history. As it turns out, not so much. This is the skull of an unfortunate and very dead orangutan, a detail scientists wouldn't discover to be the case for a further 4 decades. In the meantime, you and all your science buddies hail this hunk of fossilised ape skull as one of the greatest archaeological finds of the century. Don't you feel silly? Sadly, we don't really know for sure who exactly started this hoax, though it's commonly assumed to be the guy who found the fossil, Charles Dawson, largely because he had a well-documented history of just making up and pretending to find fantastical fossilized remains, like the fossilized frog in a rock he dubbed the toad in the hole. Despite this documented history of fraud, many took Dawson at his word, and as noted, it took decades for more sophisticated methods of analysis to conclusively prove the whole thing was a joke. Moving on, number 8, the Jovian Plutonian Gravitational Effect. Let's stay in England, and it's now 1976, April 1st, if you couldn't already guess, and you're a housewife listening to the radio while making yourself a well-earned cup of tea. Then suddenly the voice on the radio makes a bizarre but oddly compelling claim. At exactly 9:47 a.m, gravity will just, turn off. Confused, you turn up the radio and hear the voice of respected amateur astronomer Patrick Moore reiterate the previous claim, explaining that due to a rarely observed phenomenon dubbed the Jovian Plutonian Gravitational Effect, the combined gravitational pull of Jupiter and Pluto will align in such a way as to make any objects in the air at that exact moment become briefly weightless. You're skeptical, of course, but suddenly recall at school they taught you that the gravity of the moon can impact the tides themselves, and that Jupiter is like 1,000 times larger than that. Also, this is the BBC, and the voice you've just heard isn't a DJ, it's a white-haired academic, well respected in his field. Hell, he even wears a monocle. He's that serious. So at 9:47, you put down your tea and leap into the air and feel, for the briefest of moments, weightless, as if held in the air by the hand of God himself. This was an experience reported by thousands of Brits that day, many hundreds of which called the BBC to talk about experiencing weightlessness. One woman even reported that all of her friends gathered for a coffee morning being whirled around them like a paranormal activity movie or something. The reality is, no, they didn't. It was all just mass suggestion. Moore was joking and the whole thing was just the veteran presenter having a little bit of fun, with he himself later noting that anyone with a genuine enthusiasm and interest in astronomy would have known he was talking out of his arse, since Jupiter and Pluto are on opposite ends of the solar system. Moving on, number 7, the Berners Street hoax. Sticking with England once again, and you're now a well-to-do lady known to your friends and peers as Mrs. Tottenham. It's November 27th, 1809, you just heard a knock at the door. You're not expecting anyone, so you send the maid to see who it is. She returns a few moments later to inform you that it's a chimney sweep. You didn't order a chimney sweep, so you tell the maid to pass this information along. Before you can finish this sentence though, there's another knock. It's another chimney sweep, flanked by an undertaker, a piano tuner, and the mayor. What's going on? Well, it turns out you've been the victim of a wager between two men, Sam Beasley and Theodore Hook, and this is just the beginning of a very interesting day. You see, a few weeks prior, Hook had made a gentlemanly wager with his friend that he could turn any house in London into the most famous one in the whole city. Beasley, curious to see how such a thing could be achieved, agreed to the bet and selected 54 Berners Street as the address to make the literal talk of the town. Hook then spent the following few days sending letters to pretty much every business and prominent individual he could think of, writing some 4,000 in total and ordering everything from several wedding cakes to half a dozen coffins and a couple of grand pianos. The scene was, understandably, total chaos, which wasn't helped when rubbernecking denizens of London, understandably curious to see what all the fuss was about, also joined in and began just milling around the crowd of lawyers, vicars and doctors who'd been called. All in all, several thousand people tried to visit the increasingly flustered Mrs. Tottenham, who had no idea who Hook even was. Speaking of Hook, he is said to have watched the whole thing unfold from across the street with his friend, barely hiding a smirk as his friend begrudgingly handed over his winnings, a single British guinea, roughly $100 in today's money. Moving on, number 6, the Republic of Sarif. Still in the UK, but jumping forward to 1977, you're a travelling businessman enjoying your daily commute, absent-mindedly reading the paper. You probably know what day it is, when suddenly a supplement falls out from between its pages and you notice a headline that piques your curiosity. Sans Serif, a Guardian special report. Among the articles and trivia about this newly independent island nation that looks not dissimilar from a semicolon, you spot ads for recognisable products, including one for Guinness that in Sans Serif is served upside down? Curious, you read on and discover that all beer on the island looks this way, where it's the head on the bottom and the beer on the top, after farmers inadvertently planted their barley for beer upside down. You also learn that due to tidal phenomenon, the island will eventually collide with Sri Lanka, and also with a competition to tour the island as a guest of racing legend James Hunt. Then it occurs to you, why have you never heard of this place? Well, that's because it doesn't exist. Sans Serif was an elaborate hoax from the paper, supposedly inspired by a writer who was so sick of writing about places they'd never heard of, they suggested just making one up to see if anyone would even notice. Well, the idea was initially just to run a single article for April Fool's Day. This grew when the paper realised advertisers might want to get in on the joke, which is how you ended up with stuff like ads for upside down Guinness. Well, it was pretty obvious that the whole thing was a joke, since the body of many articles were nonsensical and laden with writing puns. Sans Serif itself is a pun on the font sans serif, for example. A lot of people fell for it, to the point the paper is said to have gotten several angry calls from travel agents who'd gotten sick of trying to explain that the island wasn't real. Number 5, the eruption of Mount Edcom. Okay, so enough of the UK for now. It's 1974 and you're a resident of Sitka, Alaska. You could probably guess what day it is. While enjoying your morning coffee, you glance outside to scenic Mount Edcom, a silent, foreboding sentinel of the landscape you've long since stopped noticing, even though technically it's considered to be an active volcano. But today it seems a little more active than usual. In fact, there's smoke coming out of the crater, which is a bad sign, right? Volcanoes probably shouldn't be doing that. As you walk outside to get a better look, you and your neighbours doing the same thing share some uneasy looks, and you agree that you should probably call someone, but who? Probably someone with a helicopter, so you settle on the Coast Guard, who fly into the potentially gaping maw of an about to explode volcano and spot a pile of tyres, and next to them, in 50-foot high letters, are the words, April Fools. This elaborate prank was the brainchild of Oliver Bicker, a police commissioner who figured that the whole thing would just be funny, and in an attempt to avoid too much commotion, had warned the authorities what he was going to do. Well, all of the authorities except for the Coast Guard, who reportedly weren't too happy with being called out for a prank. Widely regarded as one of the greatest pranks ever pulled, this thing made international news. Bicker spent years drinking for free off the back of it, and according to legend, got a call on the morning of the eruption of Mount St. Helens telling him he'd gone too far this time, which reportedly sent his sides into orbit. Moving on, number 4, the Great Moon Hoax. Sticking with the old US of A, and it's now August 25th, 1835, you've opened up a copy of the New York Sun, and inside is the first of a 6-part series on the moon, our closest celestial neighbour. Over the next few days, these articles reveal ever yet more fantastical things you'd never before known about our satellite, from perpetually erupting volcanoes surrounding a lake fittingly dubbed the Lake of Death, to a race of tiny bipedal beavers, as well as lots of moon pyramids built by flying bat people. Suddenly you think to yourself, well, how could anyone know this, let alone see it with such amazing clarity? The article dutifully responds, well, that is because respected astronomer John Herschel had seen it all with a ginormous 7-ton telescope, which, according to the final article, promptly burned down his laboratory when he tried to point it at the sun. This was, of course, all total and utter nonsense, but unlike almost every other prank listed thus far, we don't really know why the New York Sun suddenly decided to start reporting on giant bat people hunting moon unicorns. Some say it was to increase readership, and although articles were popular, how much they improved the overall readership of the paper is somewhat disputed. Likewise, some have suggested that the whole thing was satire, a mocking look at the wild speculation that scientific discoveries often arouse, but even this is hard to say for sure, as the authorship and thus intention of the hoax is also disputed. For the curious, a writer called Richard A. Locke is often claimed to be responsible, but we can't really say definitively. Of course, there's always the chance that it was just a joke, but the paper famously never printed a retraction or acknowledged that it was a joke. Hell, they didn't even print it on April 1st. And finally, because this is kind of funny, the aforementioned John Herschel spent the rest of his illustrious celebrated career fielding questions about moon people and unicorns. So even if the hoax was intended as a prank, it was certainly very funny either way. Number 3, the washing of the lions. Hopping back in our time machine, it's time for a trip to 18th century England, because you have an invitation to witness one of the most bizarre sights of the era, the washing of the lions, held each and every year on April 1st. What luck! You even have an invitation printed on fancy-looking parchment with a wax seal and the signature of the senior warden of the Tower of London. This grants you rare access to this once-a-year event attended by nobility, the press, and of course, some very, very dirty lions. You approach the tower, invitation in hand, and can't seem to spot the white gate mentioned in the invitation and ask a helpful-looking guard for directions. He takes one look at the invite and chuckles. You too, huh? You have just fallen for, quite literally, one of the oldest tricks in the book. There is no white gate, and while there certainly are some lions, nobody is washing them today. Exactly when this prank started, or by whom, is unclear, but it is considered to be one of the oldest pranks we know of, and it began, at least as far as we can tell, in 1698, when someone started a rumour that the lions in the Tower of London were going to be thrown into the Thames to clean them. For anyone wondering, yes, until relatively recently, the Tower of London was indeed full of animals, but that's a story for another time. Since then, it was tradition for Londoners to trick tourists into going to the tower on April 1st to see the so-called washing of the lions, with some enterprising pranksters going as far as to print out official-looking pamphlets or take out ads in papers. Number 2, when Alabama changed the value of pi. Back across the Atlantic once again, it's 1998, and the date is, of course, April 1st, and you're in Alabama. Life is, well, about as it could be, considering that you are in Alabama in the 90s. Anyway, you turn on the news and you see that Alabama state legislature has just declared the value of pi is now 3. You press your fingers to the bridge of your nose and let out a deep sigh. Of course it's fucking Alabama. Widely reported at the time, and let's be honest, widely believed, because Alabama. This story was initially circulated online and began life as a scathing bit of satire written by physicist Mike Boslow, an intentional swipe at actual attempts from New Mexico school boards to have creationism taught in schools. Boslow used actual arguments presented by creationism advocates, altering them to be about pi instead, another immutable fact necessary to our understanding of the world in which we live, and sent it to a bunch of places online, as well as a few creationism activism groups. Anyway, the piece soon took on a life of its own, and before long was being spread as fact across the web, with the parts that made it obvious it was a joke being omitted, like the credit for the story being the Associated Press. But finally, number 1, the spaghetti harvest hoax. So we're in the UK one last time. It's 1957, the date is, you guessed it, April 1st. You're watching a panorama report on the annual Swiss spaghetti harvest. It never occurred to you that spaghetti might grow on trees, but as you can plainly see right there in black and white, a well-dressed Swiss woman is pulling strands of spaghetti from a tree. There's even a voiceover from veteran news reporter Richard Dimbleby, and Dick Dimbleby wasn't the kind of man to mess around. As you watch, the disembodied voice of Dimbleby explains that this year's harvest is especially plentiful after the fearsome spaghetti weevil was all but eradicated in Switzerland. As the short, barely 3-minute long segment ends, you watch as surprisingly uniform lengths of spaghetti are carefully pulled from the trees fully grown. Before you can ask, Dimbleby dutifully explains this uniformity is a result of many years of successful crossbreeding by spaghetti farmers. You sit back and think, amazed, I never knew that. Well, you of course have once again been fooled, this time by cameraman Charles de Jager, who based the prank on an old joke a teacher would tell that students were so stupid they believed spaghetti was grown on trees, and was given the go-ahead to film the piece by bored BBC execs who figured it'd be funny. Now, it's tempting to call this one ridiculous, because surely nobody would fall for something this stupid, but it is worth noting at the time, spaghetti was considered to be exotic in the UK, not exactly helping with the stereotypes there, and fresh pasta was virtually unheard of. The closest most Brits got to pasta was seeing it in tins in tomato sauce, so it was entirely believable that it grew on trees somewhere, at least if you had no idea how it was actually made. As a result, many people at home not only fell for the prank, but actually called the BBC asking where to get a spaghetti tree of their own. According to legend, a phone girl working for the BBC with a sense of humour told everyone inquiring to put a piece of spaghetti in a tin of tomato sauce, bury it in their back garden, and wait. So this is the point where I normally say, hey, if you found this video to be entertaining, informative, and educational, go give the author some kudos on social media, but I wrote this one. So yeah, if you have a passion for writing and research and can find 10 loosely interconnected things on a singular cohesive theme and then string that all together into an article, we will pay you money for that. So yeah, there'll be links to that in the description below, but otherwise, like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff, and as I always like to say, go out there and have the day that you deserve. Cheers!